Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to the latest installment in the Black Hat Webcast series, Practical Threat Hunting, Straight Facts and Substantial Impacts, brought to you by Black Hat, Cyborg Security, and Informa. I'm with Steve Paul. I'm with Black Hat, and I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and our presenters, and later in the program we'll ask for your feedback. We strongly encourage participation and are happy to take your questions and comments. You can participate in our Q&A session by asking questions at any time. Just type them into the Ask a Question text box at the bottom left of our console. We'll answer as many questions as time permits after our presentation. Slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and PDF copies of our presentations can be found in the resource box on the bottom of our console. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the Help ? Icon on the bottom right of our console. If slides are not advancing, please press the F5 key on your keyboard to refresh your browser. And now on to the presentation, Practical Threat Hunting, Straight Facts, and Substantial Impacts. Presenting today will be Neil R. Weicker, a.k.a. Grifter, a Threat Hunting and Incident Response Specialist with RSA. And then we'll have our sponsor presenter, Dave Amsler, founder and CEO of Cyborg Security. But first, we'll hear from Neil.
Thanks, Steve. As mentioned, I'm Neil Weiler. In the security community, I'm better known as Grifter. By day, I am a principal threat hunter for RSA, and by night, I also run all the on-site technical operations for the Black Hat security briefings. I've been doing that for a while, and I'm one of the lead organizers of DEF CON. But what really matters for this discussion is the principal threat hunter role. So what that means is normally, especially when we're not in a pandemic, I would be out in our largest customer environment, hunting with them for up to a week, and then debriefing them on the things that I found. I also go into like partners or managed service providers and, go through their threat hunting programs and consult where needed. So really that's all that matters to you guys now. I've got a lot of stuff to go to in a very short amount of time, so I'm just going to get started. And we're going to start out just talking about some beginner type stuff, things you may already know, but we're going to review anyway. But we're going to say, what threat hunting is. Now, I've got a nice shiny definition here that says proactively searching through data in order to detect threats which have evaded traditional security measures. And that's a great definition if you're trying to explain some threat hunting to someone who's not in security. But for us, what threat hunting really is doing incident response when we don't know that we're already owned, right? We're making the assumption that an attacker is in our environment, and we do a lot of the same things and a lot of the same techniques that we do when we're responding to an incident. We get into that investigative mindset and we start looking to say, what are the things left behind? What are the trails the attackers are doing? If they were hiding, where would they hide? Without knowing they're already there. And sometimes we go look and turns out they are. So it is important though, because we're talking about hunting and going out and looking for attackers, that sometimes hunting becomes IR. It can turn into an incident response scenario. So knowing that your hunters, your analysts have familiarity with your incident response plan, so they know who to wake up if they need to, and what phone calls and lawyers to call and that kind of thing. Also, hunting is human-driven, not device-driven, despite what you may have been told on an expo floor somewhere that they could, a vendor can just deploy a device and hunting's going to happen for you. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a skilled individual sitting down behind a keyboard and looking for things proactively. So this is about not relying on alerts to tell us everything or relying on what we already know to clue us into the fact that we have a problem. Hunting's also iterative. This isn't something random that we're doing. We want to be able to go through our hunt process and turn around and be able to repeat what we did later. So if we decide that the information we found is of interest, then I want to go in and be able to repeat that or show another analyst or maybe create a rule or something that allows me to get to that data again. So hunting's not about going randomly clicking around places. It's about being able to repeat those processes and determine what those processes are. What hunting isn't is it's not just hitting Control F for an IOC. We're not getting an Intel feed in the morning where we get an IP address or a host name or some file hash and we just go search for that in our environment. That's Googling. That's not hunting. Again, it's not automated, right? We're not just deploying something and saying this is something that I can automate. When we do find some interesting data or something that is of use to us, it can be something we add to an automation solution, or we create a report that delivers us that information now, but it's not something, again, we're just going to deploy a box and say, that thing over there with the blinking lights on it, that's our hunter. It's also not new, despite what you have heard. Hunting's been around for forever. We just didn't call it threat hunting. And now we've kind of put this umbrella around it, this umbrella term. And really, I mean, we've all been doing threat hunting in some form or fashion for forever, right? Since the beginning of our careers. Whether that meant we were just dumping a bunch of host names into an Excel spreadsheet and sorting by which ones showed up the least often, looking for those outliers, well, believe it or not, that was hunting. Another thing that hunting is not it's not wizardry, right? Now, this is something that's perpetuated by, again, those by expo floors or maybe by other threat hunters who get up in front of a group and they're like, look at this awesome title I have of threat hunter. Doesn't that sound cool? I'm so good at what I do. You can be an expert, and having an expert in a varied, parts of security to be a threat hunter is fantastic, but you don't have to be. Even entry-level analysts can threat hunt. They just need to be given the opportunity to focus on the thing that is their skill set. Now, why are we hunting? Well, we're hunting because we're looking for the threats that we don't already know about, right? And we're doing that to reduce the dwell time that attackers are persisting within our environment. So that's our end goal here, is to just make sure that we're not in a situation where we've got somebody hanging out for a month, a year, 3 years. But we're also hunting to learn our environment. We're going to learn our environment better than we ever have before. And we're doing that because it gives us an advantage over our attacker, who I can tell you as someone who was on the offensive side of the house for many years, that the first thing you do when you get in is try to learn as much as you can so you know how you can move around or how you can persist in that environment. So we need to do that as hunters, is learn why are things architected the way they are, why are our golden images made the way that they are, and understand those things so that when we find an issue, it's going to stand out to us rather clearly. This will help us, improve that organizational posture that's so important to us. And really, this is about going in and not always just finding something bad. We don't always need to find exfiltration to some nation state or whatever. We can also just find misconfigurations, find gaps in our security. And when we start shoring up those things, it allows us to reduce our attack surface so that we're not always going out and finding somebody hanging out within our environment. And then hunting just makes our analysts better, right? Analyst burnout and analyst fatigue is real. I've been there before, sitting in that seat. So rather than constantly getting an incident that comes into you in some queue and you have to go and pay attention to that thing, being able to put yourself in an investigator's shoes, focus on the technology or the thing that's interesting to you that day, coming up with a hypothesis and going out and testing it is a hugely rewarding thing, and it's great for not only just building your technical skill and putting all the training that you've got into practice, but also, it's just good for morale, honestly. Now, if we don't write anything down, it might as well have never happened. So when it comes to threat hunts, what we want to do is write down everything that we find. So if we identify some gap within those or misconfigurations, a gap in security, we discover a vulnerability, write it down. These are the types of things we're going to deliver back to management that are going to give us the ammo we need to ask for more hours hunting or even full-time threat hunters. When we come up with that question, we ask ourselves, like, if it was me and I was trying to exfiltrate data from our environment, where would I try to get it out of? And then document why you thought of that question, how you went and investigated it, how you spent your time. Because sometimes hunts lead to, nothing. And I would say, unfortunately, nothing. But honestly, do you really want to find somebody persisting within your environment every time you start a hunt? If you do, maybe you're in the wrong field. So write these things down, though. Write down the IOCs that you discovered, new rules that you've created, new playbooks that you've created, because, again, those are the things that you're going to be able to take back to management and say, look, I spent 6 hours hunting, and yeah, we didn't find this, but we were able to find these gaps within security. We created these new rules. You know, we're making our environment better. And of course, write down when you do find a compromised host or an attacker, because those are the things that are obviously huge to the organization. These things are good so you don't have tribal knowledge within your SOC, but they're also good for those performance reviews that come around every year. So now let's talk about the data sets. Logs, of course, starting out with logs, the gold standard for decades and the gold standard for decades to come. If it creates a log, log it. Seriously, storage is cheap. Put everything on disk, so if something comes out that doesn't, in fact, turn into a declared incident or some incident response scenario, you're going to have the logs to be able to go back and try to rebuild what happened. But of course, don't forget your network data. What your ingress, egress points are in your network, like how is data flowing in and out, you know, what your subnets are, what the directionality is, right? If we see data coming into our environment, that might be completely benign, but if we saw that same type of data leaving our environment, we might have a completely different response to that. Or something that's moving laterally within our network doesn't give us any issue, but if we see it going outbound, now we've got a problem. So know how things are set up and what the architecture is like in your environment, because the way that data flows is incredibly, incredibly important when you're doing a hunt. And then, of course, full packet capture. This is one that I just think if you don't have full packet capture in your environment, it's time to fix that. Full packet capture is like video surveillance for your network. You would never build a building today and say to yourself, like, oh, we can go ahead and skip the cameras because we've got the badge scanners on the door, and that gives us a log of everybody who went in and out. We want to have that level of visibility with full packet capture, where we can say, this is what they did while they were in the environment, this is the files they interacted with, this is what they took out of the environment. And especially if you're dealing with exfiltration or you're dealing with malware, you're able to pull those files out of the stream, put them in a sandbox, or tell people this is what they took. But of course, don't forget your endpoint behavioral data as well. You know, inventory and processes, scheduled tasks, unexpected services. And I know this is all foundational stuff, right? Well, that's because this isn't, you know, rocket surgery. We're talking about doing foundational things because it's the foundational stuff that matters. When we are actually going out and dealing with attackers, we're not always dealing with the types of attacks that we love to see at a show like Black Hat, right, where somebody gets up on stage and they say, I've got this new attack, it's amazing, all we have to do is submerge the server in liquid nitrogen while we're on a boat along the equator during a total solar eclipse. And if we do that, we can dump the memory and nobody is the wiser, right? And so those are great, those are fantastic talks to go to. But attackers, even nation state ones, know that they want to take the path of least resistance. They don't want to burn a 0 day if they don't have to. So you don't always have to be focused on the most ridiculous attack you can come up with, because I can tell you attackers are using the foundational stuff because it still works. So let's talk about methods and mindset. Really what hunting is about is just situational awareness for your network. It's about setting a baseline and diffing against it over and over again. Because when you do that and you're aware of what the norms are in your network, anomalies are going to stick out like a sore thumb. It's important to note, though, that when you're looking at those anomalies, like that, they're not always going to be evil. You won't always find exfiltration, right? What you're going to find, though, will inevitably lead to some kind of education for you or for your team. You'll always find something interesting if you put yourself in the mindset to do that, where you'll be like, why is this protocol working the way that it is? Oh, I'm going to go look into it. You start digging into it, and you're reading RFCs and doing all this stuff, and in the end, it turns out it's completely benign, and that's fine, because that's just how it works in your environment, but at least now you know. Leave your preconceived notions at the door. Don't start out with IOCs. As I mentioned, this isn't about, you know, Control F, IOC. We want to come up with a question, a hypothesis, you know, like we want to put ourselves in an attacker's mindset and say, if it was me and I was attacking us, how would I come at our organization? And then go look in those places. So it's good to have that question. It's good to have that plan, but be ready to adapt. Go looking for the thing that is of interest to you, but stay flexible. If you see something, I call it seeing something shiny. So if you see something shiny, something gets your attention, harness that ADHD that's so prevalent within our industry, and now full stop, go focus on that. If something got your attention, it got your attention for a reason. It stuck out to you for a reason. So pivot to that. See what that is, investigate that. And if you're too focused on whatever that initial hypothesis was, just open another tab and say, I need to make sure that before this hunt is done, I've gone and looked at this other thing that got my attention. I'll do that. I'll just open another tab, open another tab, open another tab. So be ready to pivot all over the place. That's totally fine. And then, of course, finding tools that help you make sense of all this data that you're trying to collect. It's a lot of data, and so find the tools that work for you. Now, I know this is going to sound odd coming from a guy who works for a vendor, right? But I don't care what those tools are. They can be something from a vendor. They can be something open source. They can be whatever you want. As long as it works for your hunters and your analysts, that's what matters, because you can have the shiniest, most expensive tool in the world, but if nobody wants to use it because it's slow or it doesn't return the information that they want, then they're not going to use it at all, and that's just money out the window. So if you find yourself in a situation where, like, you work for a university or something, and you can throw a bunch of students at an open source project to get them to just manage the tool, not even use it, but just manage it, great. Good for you. But if you don't, and your team is small, or you don't have the resources to do that, maybe do buy something from, some enterprise solution where you have a support contract, or you have, a team behind that who can say, like, oh yeah, this is how you do these things. But again, whatever it is, just make sure it works for you. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just document everything that you're doing. There's another thing that's really prevalent within our industry, and that's imposter syndrome. Set that aside. The fact that you put together a blog post, or you write a white paper, or you do a conference talk, or you just send out a tweet that says, here's some advice on this thing we found during a hunt, or hey, people, you should go look for this thing. That could be the thing for one other person that keeps them from ending up on the 10 o'clock news. So just whatever you're doing, document what you're doing and share it to the rest of the community. I assure you we can use it. And even if somebody else has already talked about it before, it doesn't mean that everybody saw it. So just the more we can talk about these things and get these methods out there and processes out there, the more use they're going to get. Now, we talked about hypothesis, coming up with a question, right, that lets us seed a hunt. Where do we even start, right? I don't know how to begin a hunt. Well, here's how you can start coming up with that question to even go out and start looking. What you need to do is figure out what business you're in, right? Am I in financial? Am I in healthcare? Am I in, entertainment? What is it, right? And then so figure out what it is that the category your business is in, and what are the applications and assets that you have, and what are the risks to them, right? So what are the groups that are targeting your type of organization? Because that is where your most immediate risk is. So figure out what your application assets are, and then what the risk to those things are. And then try to understand what are the probable attack vectors for your line of business and for your applications or assets. Once you've done that, what are the techniques that are going to be used against it? What are the potential techniques or the artifacts that will be left behind by those techniques? And for each of those things, each of those artifacts, what tools apply to them? And this is twofold. What tools create those artifacts? So what are the tools the attackers are using that create those artifacts? And also, what tools can detect the type of artifacts that the attacker is going to leave behind? So again, just start answering these questions for yourself. And again, write it all down. I know I'm going to beat this to death, but document it, document it, document it. Tribal knowledge sucks. Write it down so that other hunters and other analysts within your team can come back and say, oh, that's how they came up with this question, or that's how they came up with this hypothesis, and then they're not repeating the same thing when they take their time to go and hunt. Red team, blue team it if you can, right? If you can emulate what the attacker is going to try to do to you, please do that, right? If you know that APT 29 is coming after your organization and your red team can go and emulate it, if your blue team can't find it, it's better to find that out when it's the red team emulating them rather than when the real one comes knocking. And then do it over and over and over again. A great place to find things that are good, for a hypothesis is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I'm sure almost everybody on this call is familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, but if you are the one person who's not, please go take a look. It's a great source of TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers are using, and you can literally go in there and go by industry and say, what are the groups that are targeting me? Click on that group, and then it'll be like, this is how this group conducts business. These are the types of tools that they use, and here's the types of artifacts they leave behind. So harness MITRE ATT&CK, and it's a great way to get your red team started to say, hey, here's the group that we know targets us. We want you to go emulate their, TTPs, and we'll see what we can do. And now we'll just get into me shouting randomness at you, or actual tips or things to go look for when we're talking about going out and doing a practical hunt. So one thing I'll start off, but before I get into the actual the bullet points here, is I always try to say start small and build layers. When you're starting out your hunt, we're going to be looking for things that seem like, well, obviously I would go look for that, or that doesn't seem like something that that would be malicious. And there are things that are odd that might not be malicious, but as you start to combine them with other things throughout your hunt, things get more and more sketchy, right? You start to pay attention and say, well, this is getting weird. Why is this taking place? And so what we want to do is pay attention to the number of hits we get on different things. And then as we add those up, we say, okay, this is getting more and more, interesting as a hunt. So obviously, fairly basic stuff here. Again, foundational stuff is what works. I go out into customer environments all the time, and I'm finding the bad by looking at the foundational stuff. So please do these things. Just check your logs for process creations, right? Ensure that any of the process names that you have match whatever the allowed software is for your organization, right? So what are those processes that are showing up that are outside of that? If you have the ability, verify file hashes match what your known good executables are. So if you've got your golden image and you know what all those file hashes are, and you start seeing things show up in the environment that aren't that, it's time to start paying attention. I say this here about choosing a 24-hour time window to look at processes that have executed only once or twice, once, twice, 3 times, whatever it is that you decide, or of course the size of your organization dictates, right? So if you're seeing something that's only showing up a fraction of the times compared to all of the rest of the devices which exist in your environment, what are those things? This is about finding outliers and then verifying whether or not they're good or bad. Now, we've all done this on our home machines, I'm sure, at some point, where you're looking at a process and you're like, wait a minute, what is that, right? And we go and so we're visually inspecting our processes. We go out and Google what the process name is to see if it's just somebody's like, that's malware. But if we don't see anything, we can drop it into VirusTotal or just run a search on a hash in VirusTotal. And if we really want to get into it, we can drop it in a sandbox and see what it does. Now, the 24-hour time window is true of both, looking at processes or endpoint type of things and network. When I'm doing a hunt, I'll normally focus on a 24-hour time period because it makes the amount of data digestible. And in reality, what we're trying to do is find something odd within that 24-hour time period and then expand our hunt beyond that. So if our logs and retention or our metadata or whatever goes beyond that 24-hour time window, and it should, and we see something odd, we'll then focus on that host, or we'll focus on that user and expand our hunt beyond that. So once we've got something that looks interesting to us, a particular IP address or host, then we can say, well, what have they been doing for the last 3 days? Or what have they been doing for the last 7 days? And that will allow us to start looking at, additional behavior that individual or host may be up to something. And then, use, again, this is not about, hunting isn't automated, but if you have the ability to create a playbook where you can add it to a SOAR solution and run a daily report, or have it come back and tell you like, hey, I saw these types of behavior. Being able to come in the morning and say, oh, here's the number of processes that only ran once or twice within the whole, the last 24 hours for the entire enterprise, and then just run through that really quickly is incredibly valuable. So use automation, to your benefit, but just don't rely on it to do everything for you. Of course, looking at our parent-process relationships are huge indicators that something's wrong, right? If we see command.exe running from Windward, if we see, command.exe running from Adobe Acrobat, PowerShell, making connections out to the internet, why are these things doing stuff that isn't normal, or why are they being spawned from places they normally are not, right? If we see SVC hosts being launched by anything other than services.exe, that should be a red flag to us that something's up. So pay attention to things like that. Things that are seemingly benign, like a blank or a missing company name or product version, and they might be, but it's just not normal. Again, this is about anomalies. This is about outliers. And so if we see processes that are missing company names or product versions, we're just going to want to go take a look and see what's going on. Once we've done those things, right, we can add them to allow or deny lists, but it's about going in and determining what those are and having a human doing it. Look for processes with similar names to legitimate processes, and so string similarity algorithms are great for this. So if you see something like SRVC host, or SVC host but with a 0 or something, that's the type of thing, like a string similarity algorithm. You could run that and say, okay, show me all the processes that are very similar to this process name, and then you just go in and, again, investigate and make sure whether those are valid or not valid things. And then, of course, processes just starting from odd locations. If we see, we should be able to establish a baseline, establish what normal is for us. And I will say that when we are establishing a baseline, there are great tools out there, like, UEBA solutions where you're looking at behavioral analytics. And people, again, think automation is just going to save everything in security, and they'll deploy a UEBA solution and tell it, go ahead and set me a baseline. And it will run for 2 weeks or a month, and then it will say, oh, the baseline has been determined, and then it starts flagging on things from there. The important thing to note about solutions like that is UEBA is great, and it's fantastic. I mean, if you have the ability to put a UEBA solution into place, do so. But if you deploy it and expect it to set a baseline for you without having hunters go in and look to see that you're not already owned, then they're going to see the attacker's behavior as completely normal for that environment, and they're just going to let it go. So now you've got a UEBA solution that baselines somebody persisting within the environment, and they'll stay for as long as they want. All right, when it comes to scripting, this should be a pretty easy one, right? We should have an allow list for the folks that are normally doing scripting. So if we see anybody outside of that allow list that's running PowerShell or WScript, right? Why is that suddenly happening? Why is that user suddenly taking an interest in scripting? So we want to look for things like that. We want to look for encoded commands. So if somebody's invoking encoded command on PowerShell, what is it that they're doing, and why are they trying to obfuscate whatever it is that's taking place? A piece of advice from me is just to use a naming convention for scripts, and then just alert on anything that falls outside of that. Or if you're not alerting, again, then your hunters should just know, looking at scripts, like, this is what our naming conventions are. An attacker may come into the environment and start looking around, but they might not realize what the naming convention for your scripts are in enough time that when they start deploying their tools or doing their thing, that should stick out to you pretty easily. Of course, users being added to privileged groups. This is another one where we just need to know what IT normally, what their schedule is, who does those additions, and from what accounts. Obviously, privilege escalation is huge once an attacker is in the environment. So looking for any users being added to a privileged group is always interesting. And then another one where we find some really good value is collecting your bash history in a central location. So if you see Watching a person at a command line is a good indicator of their skill level or what they might be up to. So just taking your bash history and dumping it to a central location so you can see what's going on at the command line gives you a lot of intelligence about that attacker, about their potential skill set. And it's also a good place to go look and see if there's any passwords that accidentally ended up in there. Maybe somebody, mistyped something and it got logged. I know, again, as somebody who was on the offensive side, that the bash history was always a good place to go look once you got into a box to see what that machine was used for or see if there were any potential usernames or passwords in there. So pay attention to things like that. Internal recon, right? Look for commands being run by that are normally run by admins and not by end users. So if you're seeing who am I or ipconfig or user account being run by a normal everyday end user, that's odd. And we'll go take a look and say, why is this individual looking at these things, right? So just pay attention to stuff like that. Or look for things that maybe shouldn't be run at all. Like is nmap being used by anyone outside of the security team or the network team? That's just odd. So we want to pay attention to stuff like that. When it comes to lateral movement, we're going to look for new user endpoint pairs. So a user logging into a machine that they've never logged into before, why are they doing that? Endpoint to endpoint pairs, right? So is there a host that's suddenly communicating with a server it's never communicated to before? Is there a server talking to a server that's never communicated to before? We want to pay attention to those things as well. And we also want to look for users who are logging into a machine and then quickly using credentials to log into something else, or just users who don't normally do that type of behavior and they're logging into other things using a different set of creds. Like it's something quick that you can go investigate and flag on. And of course, again, old standard type of stuff, log tampering. If we see corrupted or cleared logs, it's a telltale sign an attacker's in there cleaning up something, so pay attention for things like that. When it comes to persistence, changes to the registry shouldn't be done, by anybody who's not an admin or has the right permissions. This is also a good way to find people who maybe have permissions they shouldn't have, a level of permissions that isn't normal for that user. We found things like that before where someone has the wrong, is in the wrong group. Scheduled tasks being added, created, enabled, disabled, huge thing for persistence, as well as unknown and unapproved services. I added the privileged group, users being added to privileged groups here again because it's good for persistence as well. And then this one, I had a friend kind of say like, oh, I found some interesting things in antivirus logs. And I mean, like I said, if it creates a log it. But where does a file get cleaned or quarantined from? If somebody downloads something and it's got a virus in it and it hits their download folder and it's cleaned from there, that's one thing. But if a virus is getting cleaned out of System 32, how did it land there? Who put it there? How did it get downloaded to that spot? It's interesting to pay attention to. We want to look for stuff like, in the logs, like known bad files, so credential dumpers, scanners, or droppers, because those are the types of things that, signal us that there's an issue, and maybe somebody's trying something at a lower level, it gets cleaned out by AV, and they decide, okay, I need to come in a different way. If nothing else, it may clue us on to a more sophisticated attack that will eventually come our way. A huge one for me, artifacts in shim cache or am cache. Again, this is about knowing what is running on your endpoints and from what locations, right? So go in and look in your shim cache and am cache. It's a fantastic place to go find some really good stuff. When it comes to rename tools, look for executables with the same file hash but different directories or different names, and look for command line arguments that are known, but they're being run by something that doesn't look like PuTTY, right? So we've got the same command line argument for port forwarding in PuTTY, but it's not coming from putty.exe. So go look for things like that, or it's not, something's being RAR'd up and maybe getting ready for file staging or exfiltration, and but it's not being run by what our expectations are. When it comes to the web side of the house, look for HTTP methods that are strange. So if you see somebody doing a post with no get, that's odd. We normally get a get first, right? Look for short file name scripts or things that are outside the naming convention. So if it's a couple of characters, what is that script doing? Again, a lot of these things can be completely normal, but for what we're looking for is just those anomalies and adding them to allow and deny lists. Encoded query strings, same as the command line stuff. If somebody's encoding something, what is it? Before you'd just see like, question mark equals, and it would be like command equals catsy password from a web shell or something. But now we normally see a blob of base 64. Just go decode it and see what's going on in there. A low number of HTTP headers. There's a lot of information that goes into displaying a web page. It's usually like 8 or more headers that are in there to tell a page how it should be, delivered and how much content's coming, all of that stuff, what language to put it in, all of these things. If you are seeing 6 or less, that's worth looking at. That could be somebody who just knows what they're expecting to get, or it could just be, a machine that's doing it. So pay attention to things like that. On the host side, direct IP, I know this sounds like, 19 diggity type of advice here, but look at everything that's direct IP. Machines connect direct IP. Humans don't often do that. And so we want to pay attention to that kind of thing. A specified port number, is also something that's not normal for your average everyday user. So we're going to look at that too. Sites that are coming from weird locations or they're missing their referrers. Most people want to know where the traffic is coming from. If it's coming from a region you don't do business with, that may be the start of something you want to pay attention to. If we see content length that is missing or mismatched, this breaks the RFC. So if we're seeing things like that, where it could be because someone wrote the tool to send a specific amount of content and they've just hard-coded 4096 in there, but it changes. So look for things like those. Those are actual protocol anomalies. When it comes to user agent strings, things that are old, if you're finding somebody in your organization is connecting to your server using Internet Explorer 8, right, you're like, man, we got to update that, or Netscape Navigator Gold. Right, go pay attention to things like that. Some known bad user agent strings exist, or really short ones are things to clue in on. User agents are normally really long. And then on the DNS side, dynamic DNS, we see still being used for command and control all the time. So don't discount dynamic DNS. DGA, or domain generation algorithms, where we see what looks like seemingly random domains, but when in reality what we have is seed data between the two sides, where they know at a preset interval, I'm going to roll to this other domain, I'll roll to this other domain. So the command and control activity or communication still works, but the individual isn't going to lose their that communication, and a host name type of intelligence isn't going to be great. Look for .onion addresses or browsers or processes that aren't Tor browser. Looking up .onions, it could be a clue that somebody's maybe having the beginnings of a ransomware issue and they don't know that they're supposed to be using the right browser. When it comes to DNS tunneling, a large number of subdomains can be somebody doing low and slow exfiltration using the subdomain to exfiltrate data. Large number of single subdomains is often command and control, and look for it coming from a small set of machines. Your null and text records, pay attention to that. It's a little bit more bandwidth, but also just look for straight up file transfer over DNS. Parse for file headers. Sometimes you'll trip over zone transfers or even antivirus vendors who use DNS tunnels to move data out of your environment. And my final slide, let's talk about encryption. Encrypted traffic, everybody's like, oh, there's nothing you can do there. Well, the metadata is still valuable. There's a lot of things that you can infer from the source and destination, the session length or session size. There's a lot of things that are good to know about the cipher suite, those type of things. Save the metadata even if you're dropping the payload. Use JAW3 if you can. Signatures will give you high confidence in the types of clients and servers that you're talking to. And then, of course, decryption. I mentioned, I've been running the Black Hat NOC for the last 18 years. We have seen encryption go up about 5% year over year, and now we're seeing 70 to 80%. If you can't see into that data for your organization, then you're missing a lot. So find a decryption solution that works for you. And then even if your security tool can do it, I would say don't have your security tool do it, because it is incredibly resource intensive, and you can take an impact to whatever that tool is. So maybe that's just my own personal advice. And with that, thanks. I will say that was a ton of stuff, and I talked really, really fast. If you want to hear more about stuff like this, the URL on the screen here, I'm doing a webinar on December 8th where I will go through this in much more detail. And there'll also be a couple of hands-on labs where you can get in and hunt in a cloud-based threat environment. And so if you're interested in that, please hit up that link, and we'll see you in December. All right, back to Steve.
Great. Thanks very much. Excellent presentation. Just let our audience know that we will be taking more questions and answering as many as we can at the end of our second presentation. Our next up is our sponsor presenter, Dave Amsler, founder and CEO of Cyborg Security. So over to you, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Steve and Neil. Awesome presentation. Hope everyone's doing well. Listen, I'll caveat it right off the bat. This is not a sales presentation. I got a few slides at the end. Of course, we got to keep the lights on at the end. But this is a world I've lived in my entire career. Prior to founding Cyborg, I had self-funded and founded a company called Foreground Security, which was a managed threat hunting service provider. I sold that to Raytheon in 2015. Still live in the world. The entire team that was prior at Foreground, some of the key leaders, some of the key technical staff are all part of the DNA of the new company, and we live in this world. So I love that presentation. I'm probably just going to pile onto it a whole bunch here and fly through a few things. But the goal of Cyborg is to be a leader, to help a lot of these organizations in that threat hunting capability. What Neil just went through is exactly right. There's a lot of techniques. It's a lot of value in hunting. And most organizations today, there was a SANS survey just done back in June that said about 93% of organizations agree they need to be able to do threat hunting. It is a priority of theirs, and they see the value in it. But how do you do it becomes the big challenge. And, most people say they're doing it. About 18% are only mature at this point, and most organizations are struggling because, as you just saw, there's a lot of capabilities, a lot of techniques, a lot of knowledge, a lot of creating ad hoc new types of content, new types of searches, new types of hypothesis and techniques. And everybody can do it, but it's time consuming. It requires expertise. And I believe that's where there's a gap in the market today. And that's kind of what we're trying to attack and be a part of and help the community. And a lot of the SANS survey statistics will show that to you, that most organizations, 70%, are trying to do it, but they're immature. They don't have a lot of processes. They don't have a lot of capabilities. Maybe they have a person or two that's good at it, but is that repeatable? Is that documented? Is that something that can continue to go on? Because as you saw, it's not just a one and done. It's not some magic bullet tool you can deploy. It's intelligent hypothesis. It's intelligent searching techniques. It's content that's deployed in visibility tools or other security tools. So what we've found is a lot of people are relying upon technology to do this, believing that's the answer, and we'll get into that in a moment. So how do we get better at it? Well, we're relying too much on threat intelligence feeds. I even hate to even use the word intelligence because there's a lot of non-intelligence in those feeds. It's really just a lot of indicator feeds, and we'll dive into why that's not significant value. A lot of the security tools are selling you content, quote unquote, whether that's rules, detection rules, whether that's search content that deploys inside of a SIEM or an EDR solution. And of course, in all of these conversations, it requires skilled staff. And I'll go ahead and just jump on one. I saw a question come across, and it's always something that we have a conversation around, and that's, well, where does AI and machine learning fit into this? And if the major technology companies of the world haven't solved AI for basic human functions, which Google will tell you they're still working on, I'm positive we're not at the point anywhere soon where a machine is going to think like a human in threat hunting. I always give this analogy that if I took my best threat hunter and I locked them in a closet for a month, they are not nearly as good or any good at their job any longer because they no longer know what's the latest techniques and tactics, what the threat actor is looking like, what types of hypotheses should I be developing, what should I be looking for. So an AI engine, if it doesn't know what to look for and is not continuing to be told, here's the newest techniques and tactics and procedures, they're not worth anything either. So I've been mentioning this word content, and content comes in different forms, but in generic terms, it's what Neil went through. It's ways to go look for anomalies, outliers, patterns, using either intelligence, using hypothesis. It's complex in nature, it's behavioral in some cases, and it's got to be robust. You can't just look for one thing. Neil just spent a lot of great time in detail, and he ran through it quickly, of the different things we need to go look for. And so how do you do that? So where does content today come from? I would say, and the SAN survey will tell you, open source, industry shared threat content is a majority of where people are getting it. And in-house being a very small percentage, or you're getting it from your security tool provider as a platform. So if we're getting this generic content as the majority of it, it's generic in nature. It's not highly intelligent. It has a very low contextualization to it. And I'll give you a very simple example. If we're just using a piece of content that says, hey, this IP address was bad, it was disseminated, this kind of attack, maybe it tells you, hey, we need to look for this specific executable or this specific signature. It might go a little bit further than that, but in most cases, not any further. So I run that type of search in my data, whether it's in my SIM, my EDR, wherever it happens to be, and what I'm going to end up with is about 90-something% of false positives, because the honest truth was that IP address was only bad for 6 hours last Tuesday. It was against a specific market. It was a specific operating system. It was doing a specific set of commands, and then it was pivoting because the threat actor associated with its techniques and tactics told you now should be going to look for these specific type of activities. And a registry entry was created. I'm just using an example. And so by using this generic open source content, all we're really doing is creating more analyst fatigue. We're creating a whole bunch of false positives. So to do it properly, we got to do it more specific to my environment, more specific to my market, more specific to my systems, and that requires time, that requires expertise. So in today's world, to do content, you have to do the research. You got to collect the information. You got to understand what's applicable. You got to understand the TTPs. You got to understand your environment. You got to create run books. You got to analyze the piece of content you created. You got to write it. You got to test it and validate it. You got to then document it properly so that an analyst, when it pops up on a screen that didn't write the piece of threat hunting content, knows what it is, who it is, what should I be doing next, and that snow piles on itself. And I saw a bunch of questions come in around, well, if I'm a few-person shop, how do I do this? Is there some magic bullet tool out there that does this? And the answer is no, and there's not one coming. To do content properly, you have to understand the threats. You got to understand the true context behind it. It's not just an indicator. It's not an IP address. It's not a domain. It's not a signature. It's multiple other pieces of contextualization of what am I really looking for. I have to analyze that attack. I have to create a piece of content, whether that's a detection rule, whether that's a search tool in my SIM, whether that's an EDR rule, if you go down the line. And the big thing that I think most people fall down with is I actually have to test that works properly. And then I have to make sure that it's not going to ruin my system, create a bunch of false positives. And the other thing that we find a lot is the validation is significantly lacking. And here's an example. We can hand out great pieces of threat hunting content to an organization. They deploy it in their environment. And what we're going to get back is, hey, it didn't work. Well, what do you mean it didn't work? Well, what that might mean is you're actually not compromised by that type of specific attack, that specific threat actor, or that campaign right now, which is a good thing. So how do you know that piece of content actually worked? And so what we develop is validation capabilities and ways to actually run that simulated attack, create those specific types of alerts to know that if that attack actually happens, your piece of content is truly alerting properly. And then, as Neil spent a lot of time on, what happens next? Because even if you have somebody creating this content, they're not going to be the ones watching the consoles when an alert goes off. So what does this mean? Who is the attacker? Are there other pieces of content I should go look for? What is their TTPs? Who's the threat actor? What other things should I be collecting? What do I do next? So there's an entire process to this to be done right. And I kind of ran through a lot of this analysis and creation and optimization and validating it already, so I'm just going to jump for time purposes. So what does something like that really look like? So I already went through. You need to know what is the specific use case I'm looking for. Who is the attacker? What is the attack? What is the technique I'm looking for? What's my hypothesis? What's the applicability to my environment? What systems? What networks? What's the behaviors and TTPs I'm looking for? What would the threat pivoting look like? What's the intelligence and contextualization? I don't want just an IP address. I want more specifics. It was last Tuesday. It was this operating system. It was this specific command running. It was these DLLs it was doing. It was a registry entry that was created. I then need to test that, validate that, put in recommended actions. And again, that's a true piece of content. And I gave an example here, and it's hard to see, but this is what a potential piece of threat hunting content would look like inside of maybe a SIM tool, for example. And the initial one that we took an example of, that we took from an open source tool that a lot of people use for sharing of threat hunting rules, and it'll allow you to convert from one tool to another. And it was so generic in nature, we deployed it, and it found 0.7% of true positives. That meant 99.3% of every alert that was sent out in a tool was a false positive because it was too generic in nature. It was just some basic indicators. Whereas we then took that piece of content, put all the contextualization into it, tested, validated it, optimized it, and we were able to put about 71.43% of positive alerts and reduce the false positives to about 28%. We're never going to get to 100. It's just the way systems are and networks are designed. There are going to be some alerts, but you can see the value in something like that. And that was just, jumping forward a little bit. And for time purposes, so what did Cyborg decide to do? Well, we are a threat hunting content provider. We believe to be a part of your team to make you better, and we create that threat hunting content for you. We create the entire contextualized piece. It's customized to your environment through our intellectual property. We give you the validation capability. We give you the next steps. We give you the ability to pivot off of that and know what to do, what other content might you want to look for, updates to that content, and it comes in all shapes and sizes. And we do it through our Hunter platform, which is really just a way to deliver it to you, a way for you to manage the content you want to use, all your analysts to go to search against it, such as maybe a piece of content pops off. Well, who is that actor? What other content might I want to look for? What actions do I want to do next? Is there a new piece of this content that's been updated because maybe the TTPs have changed? And so the portal Threat Hunter is really just delivering it. The key to it is no organization, big or small, Fortune 50 to Fortune 5000, can have enough threat hunters to do this on a regular basis themselves. And so we have developed this portal and this capability to augment that and be a part of that team. It's living, it's continuous. Content is being developed by a large group of experts every single day. It can be customized to your specific environment. We give you the testing and validation. Again, a nice place to have everything documented. And here's just an example of starter kits. Everything from process execution outliers to privilege escalation to suspicious scheduled tasks. A lot of things Neil talked about, to specific types of attacks such as EMATET or registry modification. There's a lot of bucketized groups of content, whether it's detection content that is more hypothesis-based, whether it's a new type of threat is out there like Emotet or some other new adversarial campaign that's out there, and we create that content in a lot of the major tool sets that most organizations would use where their visibility exists. And so with that, I know I ran through it quickly because, Neil, you did an amazing job. Again, I want to thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out through our website, through LinkedIn, through Twitter, or myself specifically.
Okay. Well, fantastic job, gentlemen. Thanks very much. Yeah, unfortunately, we do just have a few minutes, but we do have a number of questions. We'll take to as many as we can. Just want to remind our audience that you can download PDFs of the events. We also had a couple of requests for links to upcoming webinar that Neil will be involved in. So I'm going to push that out for people to register for. Hope to see you there. And let's just jump right into it in terms of our audience questions. First one up is, let's see here, from Mike early on. Maybe, Neil, you can comment on AI implications for threat hunting.
Oh, man, I love it. So I think one thing is we kind of have to rely on some machine learning. We have to rely on AI to help us get through the insane amount of data that we have. The thing is that we can't rely on it completely. I think that there are a lot of great tools out there, and there are a lot of great solutions, but none of them are this silver bullet that just does everything for us. I have high hopes for things like automated solutions or machine learning and AI stuff coming down the road. I just don't think that anyone is really there yet. Again, they give us a helping hand, but they don't solve things for us. Not yet, anyway.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Just a reminder also for our audience, we do have a feedback survey that's on our console and will appear at the end of the event, so we'd greatly appreciate if you give us some feedback on how you thought today's event went and how we can improve on future events. Also a reminder that we'll have a December 3rd webinar, and you'll get invitations for that, so hope to see you in a couple of weeks as well. Nick is asking, does the hunt stop at IOC discovery phase? Is IR process, should that kick in next? Back to Neil.
Sure. So I would say that it doesn't stop at the IOC discovery phase. It doesn't, you just start including the incident response team. And then obviously it would depend on the severity of it. I have been in hunts where I have discovered active exfiltration, like it's taking place while I'm sitting there doing the hunting in the customer environment. And I will then call somebody in and be like, this is happening right now. What do you want me to do? And then obviously if it's something like that, it can become very serious very fast. If it's something where you're like, oh, it looks like there's evidence that there may have been something here, involving other individuals on the team, getting verification, starting to say okay, well, what do we need to do here? That's why I say the knowledge of the incident response plan is key, so that when you do come up against that IOC, whether that is just a small amount of evidence that maybe somebody was kicking the tires on your organization, or you're finding active exfiltration to some nation state somewhere, that the responses for those things are obviously different. But I think it's much like penetration testing, where when you go into an organization, once you get in, the job's not done. It's the same thing with hunting. Once you discover something, the job's not done. You just keep digging and trying to find more and more evidence. Also, when you discover those things and you notice that there is an active attack that's taking place, or something becomes a declared incident, the intelligence that you can gain by continuing to hunt is incredibly useful intelligence to the organization, because it is, in fact, directed at you and not just broad intelligence. So my advice is just keep on hunting, but involve the right team.
Okay, fantastic. Why don't we wrap up with a quick question here? Either one of you, if you want to just chime in on what do you think are the must-have hunting tools and I know that you may want to stay a little bit generic in your responses or a little bit biased. That's fine for now. So, Neil, any quick thoughts?
I'll be super quick, and then I'll let Dave answer. But my thing are just, having the normal things you'd have in a SOC, right? Extensive logging, a SIM that helps you organize that data, full packet capture, again, and a way to carve through that data. Having an automation solution that helps you create playbooks and execute on those things, and then also, I mentioned UEBA, like having something that helps you understand behavioral analytics, and then and just see what your users are doing that's outside of the norm is also useful. But yeah, I won't name any particular names. Find the stuff that works for you guys. Dave?
Yeah, honestly, you said it. It's visibility. There is no magic bullet hunting tool. There's advanced hunting capability and content, but if you don't have visibility, it doesn't work.
Okay. Well, thanks, gentlemen. Excellent presentation. A lot of great questions. We want to appreciate your participating. We want to thank our audience for attending today's Black Hat webinar, Practical Threat Hunting, Straight Facts, and Substantial Impacts, brought to you by Black Hat, Cyborg Security, and Informa. Shortly after this live event, we'll send you an email so you can access this presentation on demand. And on behalf of our guests, Neil R. Weicker, a.k.a. Grifter, Threat Hunting and Incident Response Specialist with RSA, and our sponsor presenter, Dave Amsler, founder and CEO of Cyborg Security, we want to thank you all for your time, and have a great day.